Alright, so today I want to cover 10 things to look for when buying a ball python, especially if you're buying a ball python in person, such as at a reptile show. And I've sold probably hundreds of ball python hatchlings over the last few years at some of the local shows, and I'd say probably 9 times out of 10, most people don't know what to look for when they're looking at the ball pythons, and a lot of people really don't know the questions to ask when they're buying a ball python. So I actually made a list of 10 things that you should look for when buying a ball python, and the number one thing on my list is you can ask the question, is that ball python friendly or is it aggressive? And I'd say this is pretty much a question that is pretty specific to the age of the ball python. Usually you really don't ask that question for hatchlings or juveniles because, you know, when a ball python first comes out of the egg, it is super friendly. I've never been bit by a hatchling ball python that just comes out of the egg. As a matter of fact, sometimes they're really hard to get on food at the very beginning, and it seems like the only thing they'll eat right at the beginning, right out of the egg, are mouse hoppers, live mouse hoppers. And once you get a few mouse hoppers into your ball python hatchling, it seems like they go through a phase where they just absolutely bite everything, and they don't know the difference between a mouse hopper and your finger or your hand or your arm, and they just kind of go crazy. Some of them are kind of really aggressive when they go through that phase, and really to kind of snap them out of that phase, you don't have to handle them that much. Sometimes you can just pick them up and handle them for an hour, sometimes even 2 hours, and that ball python hatchling will completely change. It'll figure out the difference between your hand and a mouse hopper really quick. But a lot of hatchlings that aren't handled, a lot of times they can be pretty nippy. And I'd say pretty much for hatchlings and juveniles, you can pretty much snap them out of that mode really quickly. But on the other hand, if you're actually buying an adult, say for example, if you bought a snake like Bobby here, he's a 7-year-old bamboo ball python. And if you actually had a snake like this that was aggressive, I've actually had a couple of them in my collection, and usually what that's from is they've had some kind of traumatic experience where they associate you with the trauma that they went through. And the 2 times that I've had aggressive snakes here in my collection, I actually had them shipped in through the mail on the back of one of the delivery trucks. They got bounced around and beat up, and I took them out of the box, and for some reason they associated the traumatic shipping process with me. They thought I kind of, you know, was responsible for all the damage that actually, well, I'd say they probably weren't packed very good in the first place. The 2 times that I've actually had some aggressive snakes, and they remembered that, and as adults, it seemed like they kind of had this grudge against me, and they were always really aggressive. And it seems like usually if they don't go through a traumatic experience like that, it's really easy to snap them out of it. But if they do go through something that's pretty traumatic, sometimes they'll be kind of an aggressive ball python for their whole life. And I found with the 2 aggressive ball pythons that I've had, I've actually seen they can be really difficult feeders, especially if you're trying to feed frozen thawed and you open up the tub and you're trying to feed them, and what they actually see is they're looking around the rodent and they're looking at the person, and they get really defensive, and instead of eating the rodent, they'll actually go into a defensive mode, and sometimes it can be kind of difficult to feed them. But I'd say if you're actually buying juveniles or hatchlings, most people, it's kind of an irrelevant question. Is that hatchling aggressive or if it's friendly? Because it really doesn't matter. With just a little bit of handling, you can easily tame it down and make it really friendly. Alright, so number 2, I would definitely ask about the genetics. And when I first got into crested geckos, that's kind of the things, I actually got into crested geckos, got a male and a female, and I wasn't really thinking about breeding. I was just thinking about setting up an enclosure, and maybe if they bred, I was like, okay, you know, I'll have some offspring. I wasn't really intending on breeding them. And after I got them home, I realized that I didn't write down the genetics and the genes on those crested geckos. So if they did breed, I didn't know what the genetics were for the offspring. Come to find out, I actually bought a super Dalmatian crested gecko, which is really expensive. I think I paid like $250 for it. I've actually seen them sell for like $500 or $600 for a crested gecko like that, which is kind of crazy. And it's kind of the same with ball pythons, especially if you're buying one just as a pet and you get one like this, like a beautiful bamboo ball python, and then you bring it home, and then other people are saying, hey, I want a snake just like that. And it really helps to know which genes are in that ball python if you want to buy another one, or if you intend to breed them some point in the future. All right, so number 3, you definitely want to ask what the snake is eating and when it ate last. And I kind of made some mistakes when I was buying some ball pythons. As a matter of fact, I bought one that was listed as a mouser only. It was an adult, probably about the size of Bobby here, full-size adult female. It was listed as a mouser. And let me tell you, if you actually have a ball python that will only eat mice, sometimes it's really hard to keep the weight on a ball python because you pretty much need to switch them over to rats to get, especially if you're breeding them, trying to get them into breeding condition, it's really hard for a mouser. And I'd say, even with the mouser, sometimes you can do it. I'd say, if you're feeding them mice, a lot of times you can breed them every other year because they're a little bit slower growers on a mouser only. And as far as the last time they ate, sometimes that can be a little bit tricky, I'd say. Usually in most cases, especially if a snake ate like just recently, you have to really be careful not to handle him too much because you can risk regurgitation. But other than that, ball pythons can go on a really long fast for a long time, and they kind of just snap out of it and go back on food. That's kind of the nature of ball pythons. That's one of the frustrating things I'd say mainly about ball pythons. As a matter of fact, Bobby here, he just fasted for about 2 months. Didn't eat anything for 2 months. I was offering rodents every single week, week after week, and just recently he went back on food. Usually he's pretty good about eating one rodent every single week, but sometimes he'll just fast and won't eat for months at a time, which can be pretty nerve-wracking. All right, so number 4, this is a thing that a lot of people, I'd say most people, are not aware of, but if you actually go over on some of the reptile forums, you'll find out that a lot of people have problems with burns on the belly of their ball pythons. Especially, I've seen some people say, hey, I got this burn or this red spot on the belly of my ball python and the scales are coming off. And let me tell you, that is usually from using a heat rock in your enclosure. I've seen some people use kind of the reptile style heat rocks, and when ball pythons crawl up on those heat rocks, it's too much heat for the snake and it can actually burn the belly of the ball python. I've actually seen a lot of people have their snakes die from burns on the belly. So if you're actually thinking about buying a snake, what I would do is I would look at the belly and make sure it has a clear belly. Usually it's a pretty white belly. Sometimes you can actually have some pink on the belly when they go into shed or when they're about to go into shed. But if you actually have any really red spots or if you have some scales falling off, I would probably avoid buying that ball python. All right, so number 5, you actually want to check for scars on the snake. And I've actually had some rats do some damage to some of my ball pythons. So if you actually are into ball pythons on a larger scale, like I have, sometimes I'll have like 100, 150 ball pythons here and I'm trying to feed them. And let me tell you, if you're actually feeding live rodents, it is a completely different game. When I do frozen thawed and I go through my collection, I'll get maybe 1 out of 3 snakes to eat on any particular day. So I say most of my snakes are kind of picky, and some of them are regular eaters, but a lot of them will kind of just go in and out of the cycle as far as eating. But if you actually switch over to live, you can actually feed live rodents, and I'd say probably 90% of all your ball pythons will eat. And when I first started feeding live, I thought, man, this is the best thing ever. I'm going to feed all my snakes live rodents. And the problem is the rodents can damage the snake. And I actually had one snake that took a bite from a rodent and had a scar on the side of the snake. And after that, I was like, all right, I'm never doing live again. I'm going back to frozen thawed because it's just too dangerous for the snake. But if you actually have some snakes that have a little bit of weight on them, a little bit of age on them, I definitely check the whole body for scars and make sure you definitely are aware of any scars on that ball python. Sometimes if you buy them and they're all balled up, you definitely want to stretch them out and kind of look at the whole snake and make sure that you don't have any damage. Or if, it's probably not a problem if it actually has a scar on it, but you just want to make sure of the condition of the snake before you get it home, and then you're surprised by something like a scar on the ball python. All right, so number 6 is kinks in the spine. So this is pretty common. I'd say probably one of the most common genetic defects that I've seen. I'd say it's as far as the genetic defects is common, but I'd say a lot of times most ball pythons don't have kinks. Sometimes the kinking can be associated with certain genes. Some people say like the caramel albino is a little susceptible to kinking. Sometimes the super cinnamon or super black pastel can have a higher occurrence of kinking. I've actually heard heard some people say that the Ultramel can have some kinking in the spine, and it's kind of interesting. I went to a reptile show and I was thinking about buying this ball python, and it was a little hatchling all balled up, and I was kind of pacing back and forth trying to decide, all right, do I want to spend the $400 to buy this hatchling? And then after I was holding that snake for about a half an hour, to my surprise, it completely stretched out, and when it stretches out, you can actually hold the spine and look at how straight the spine is, and if it has a kink in the spine, you'll actually see kind of a little curve right in the spine where the snake can't completely straighten out, and that is a genetic defect, a kink. And sometimes you can have really severe kinking all through the spine, and sometimes you can almost barely see a tiny little kink in the spine. And if the kink is down towards the vent area, sometimes, especially with females, it can interfere with breeding that ball python. So I definitely avoid any kinking, especially if you're thinking about breeding your ball python. So that's one thing you definitely want to look for when buying a ball python. All right, so number 7, you want to check for mites, and I'd say mites is probably one of the biggest problems. Let me tell you, you don't want mites in your collection. Actually, when I first started, I was just buying snakes left and right, and I had no quarantine area set up here in my reptile room or anywhere here in my facility. And I actually brought in a snake that had mites. I think I was up to like 20 ball pythons before I finally brought one in, and it had mites, and I got mites through my whole collection. And let me tell you, it took me months and months of sprays and wipes and all kinds of, checking on them. You're changing all the substrate every single day to finally get rid of those mites. And usually you can check if you have mites. It's almost like little black spots all over your snake. Sometimes you can actually rub your hand on the ball python and then look at your hand to see if you have any little black spots on your hand. And a lot of times the mites will kind of burrow in between the scales and they get stuck in there where you can't wipe them off. But if you see a little black spot crawling around on a ball python, let me tell you, you do not want to buy that ball python. And usually on your white snakes, you can actually see little red sores all over the ball python because the mites go in between the scales, and then what they'll do is they'll actually suck the blood from the snake, and then they'll back out and then move to another spot, leaving behind a sore. And a lot of times on your dark snakes, like maybe on Bobby you might be able to see it, but like on a dark normal or something like that, or like a cinnamon or one of the dark genes, a lot of times you really can't see it. But if you have like a blue-eyed leucistic, a completely white snake, you could definitely see mites. It's pretty obvious. And let me tell you, you definitely want to stay away from mites if you're buying a ball python. All right, so number 8 is respiratory infections. And usually with respiratory infections, usually you hear some kind of a noise coming from the snake. Sometimes it can be a little bit of hissing when they're breathing. And let me tell you, you definitely want to stay away from any snakes with respiratory infections. And sometimes you can actually see a little bubbling around the mouth. Although I've actually seen where it can be a little bit tricky. I've actually had some ball pythons drink some water. Actually, as a matter of fact, I actually had my really big reticulated python. She just finished drinking a bunch of water, and then I fed her a rat, and when she grabbed that rat, all this water came out of her mouth, and I was like, what in the world is going on with my reticulated python? So if they're drinking water and then you pick them up, or if they eat a rat right away, sometimes you can have a lot of fluid coming out of the mouth. It can kind of trick you. But let me tell you, if you actually hear any kind of a wheezing or any kind of a sound coming from your ball python, there's definitely a problem, and you should stay away from it. Primarily, I'd say it's mostly from a respiratory infection. All right, so number 9 is eye problems. So you want to take a close look at the eyes. I've actually seen some genetic defects where a snake can be born with no eyes or missing an eye. And I've actually seen some damage from rodents. I'd say probably one of the most popular places where a snake will get damaged from a rodent is in the eye. Sometimes a rat or a mouse can take out the eye of a snake. So you definitely want to make sure that the eyes are okay. And another thing you want to check as far as the eyes, you want to make sure that both eyes are the same color, especially if you intend on breeding that snake. There's actually a genetic condition called a chimera, which is kind of a weird anomaly. I'd say it's pretty rare. I haven't seen too many chimeras, and essentially what it is, it's when you actually have 2 separate eggs that fuse together into a single individual, and you'll have half the snake has a different DNA than the other half of the snake, kind of side by side merging of 2 individuals. And sometimes with chimeras, they'll have have different eye colors on either side of the head. I've actually had one here in my collection. I actually sold it. It was a spider pied. It had two different eyes. Possibly could have been a chimera. And a lot of times the chimeras will actually have a line right down the top of the head that'll split the snake. You'll actually see one side of the head is a little different color than the other side of the head. And some of those can be sterile. Some of them can have problems breeding. And sometimes you can actually have two different sets of DNA in that snake. And you can actually have a visual appearance of one snake. And then when you breed it, you'll actually get the DNA from another gene that's in the snake. And you'll get kind of unexpected results. I've seen some pretty wild results when breeding chimeras. All right, so number 10, the last thing you should look for when buying a new ball python, and that is head wobble. And head wobble is a neurological defect that is associated with certain genes. Some people say you have a higher occurrence of head wobble in the spider gene or the champagne gene or certain combinations. I've actually heard the super spot nose can be susceptible to head wobble. As a matter of fact, I've actually seen some ball pythons that have some head wobble with none of the genes that are associated with head wobble. Sometimes you can have just a weird random neurological issue. And essentially what head wobble is, it's almost like the ball python can't get its head completely straight. Sometimes you'll see them kind of putting their head at an angle. Sometimes you'll see some stargazing where it's kind of at a weird angle and they're like looking up at the stars. And I've actually seen in severe cases, for example, if you actually take a ball python like Bobby here, has no head wobble. This is a bamboo. There's no head wobble associated with bamboo. And you see how sturdy and stable his head is right here. I've actually seen some ball pythons where you kind of pick them up just a little bit back from the end of the head, like right here, and you'll actually see them kind of do a corkscrewing effect with their head, which can be really disturbing the first time you've seen it. I've actually seen the worst case of head wobble in one of my local pet stores where the snake was crawling on its back because it had such a severe case of head wobble. And personally, I don't think we should bring really severe cases of head wobble into the pet industry and sell those snakes at any type of a store or a reptile show. And let me tell you, when it comes to head wobble and any of the genes associated with the head wobble, it's probably one of the most controversial issues, but you definitely want to know what you're getting into. And most people will say if you have a little bit of head wobble, if you buy a spider or a champagne and you see just a little kind of an awkward kind of an angle of the head, most people will say that they'll feed properly and that they will thrive and they make really good pets. So there's a lot of controversy over the whole head wobble thing, but it's definitely one of the things that you want to check buying a ball python. So that is pretty much it. Thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next video.